Hello, my name is Jim Kibler, and this is a continuation of the series on building our flintlock rifle kit, our Colonial flintlock rifle kit made by Kibler's Long Rifles. So if you haven't seen the previous videos, it'd probably make sense to go back and check those out. There's quite a number of videos and a good amount of information. It'll probably be helpful if you're interested in this sort of thing. We left off with the last video with basically an assembled rifle. So this gun would be ready to shoot. All the pieces are installed, ready to go. However, you can see it's just bare wood, so no wood finishing has been done or metal finishing has been done. So that's where our attention will head in this particular video. So the first step is to look and see all the metal parts and see how the wood matches up with any of the metal parts. For example, one place to look is the tang. So you can see a little bit of wood, perhaps you can see in the video right here, a little bit of wood is above the tang, which is fine, it's not a big deal at all, but we want to flush that off, so we don't want any wood protruding above the metal parts. It's a quite small amount, not a lot at all, and it'll vary a little bit from kit to kit, but that needs to be cleaned off and flushed with the barrel. You can use a file. A file works real well. You could also use sandpaper wrapped around a block. That would be fine too. I see I have some kind of debris in my file here, so I'm going to try to clean it out a little bit if I can. The file card, although it's not coming out too well. So I'm going to use a file and flush this off. So we'll get after it here. Now it'll be easiest, I'm going to go ahead and take out the lock. It will be easiest to do this with the lock out. Okay. Okay, we pretty much got it. And that'll be sanded, so if it's a tiny bit high, that won't be a problem. You still need to sand it down. Now, since we filed it, the flat along the tang is beside the tang is a little big, so what we'll do is we'll blend that off a little bit by bringing it over a tiny bit closer to the tang. Although you wouldn't have to do this, but it just look a little better. We still have a little bit to come off here. Okay, and we'll do the same here. Okay, and that pretty much has it. Over just a little bit, and then we'll kind of round it back a bit. Now, one thing I would like to note is that the tang pretty much remains flat. You could have a very, very tiny curve to the tang, but traditionally the tang is basically flat, and you do end up with a little bit of a flat area of wood behind the tang, and it kind of just gradually transitions and turns into a little more of a rounded wrist. And that's perfectly normal, perfectly acceptable. In fact, it's how it should be. Okay, so that job is done there. So we're going to move on to the butt plate and see. So there's a tiny little bit of wood above the butt plate, so we're going to go ahead and do this. Use the same procedure on the butt plate. The comb of the butt plate. I can clamp, I'm gonna move the box lid here so I can clamp it up a little better. Okay, so the place we're looking is right here, just a tiny little bit of wood sticking up. So we're gonna get after that, and I'm gonna move a little bit here so I can use the file a little easier. And the idea here is we just wanna file it off flush and blend it forward just a little bit. You don't wanna just file it right at that point. You wanna blend it forward so it transitions. There's nothing wrong with hitting the metal parts, and if the metal parts happen to be a tiny bit high or something, just file those down too. Nothing wrong with that at all. These are all steps we're taking to make a very fine rifle. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. That'll be good. Okay, so let's look on other areas. Another area might be the entry pipe. There can sometimes be a little bit of wood above it. Just is looking pretty good. I might have already filed it, I don't remember, but it's looking pretty good. Make sure it's down in the inlet. And then there is a little bit of wood, so we're gonna continue at the same angle as the flat. And the flat, by the flat I mean this facet on the tab of the entry pipes. We're gonna maintain that same angle and just file any wood that might be a little high. And then again, kind of blend it back. That's looking good there. Now we're gonna do the other side. And I'm just going down just till I start to kiss the metal part. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Now we'll put our attention to the front of the guard. In this case, make sure it's down in the inlet again. That it worked up a little bit. If your part does want to kind of work out of the inlet, bend it down at the front a little bit, so then when it's pinned in place, it'll have a little spring that's holding it down in the front of the inlet. So we could bend this down a little bit if we wanted to when we take the guard out. But you can see it's a little bit below the wood here. So we'll try to, this is an area that's maybe going to be a little more difficult, but we'll try to, yeah, it's going to be fine. We'll sand that down a little bit. This will all get finished up too when we take the parts out of the stock to sand it down, but this is just like a first step just to get us real close. That'll be okay, and we'll finish up that little bit when we take the guard out of the stock. Come on. So I'll make a mental note that that's a little bit high there, the wood, so I'll hit it a little bit more when we sand the stock. Now the final area is there's this particular tail end of the butt plate, or the guard, is a little bit below grade, a little bit more than I expected for some reason, but it's more than I typically get, but it's no big deal whatsoever. So what we'll do is we'll wait until we take the guard out, and then we'll sand the stock down a little bit and make it so it's not below grade. So this is gonna wait until we pull the guard out of the stock. So let's see here. One final area that would be good to hit before disassembly is there's a tiny bit of wood, just a tiny bit of wood sticking above the toe of the gun. So we can make note of that, mental note of that when we sand it down, or we can kind of flush it off a little bit right now. Let's see what I can do here. We could use a sanding block, or we can use a file. If we can hold it a little back here a little more, it'll make it easier. And it's okay if the butt plate extends a little bit past the wood. That's acceptable, but you don't want the wood to extend past the butt plate. Here's a little fine rasp that I'll use, but I could just use some sandpaper too if I wanted. Lots of ways to get the job done. Now this rasp was a good quality rasp, but it's starting to go a little dull. Okay, that's looking pretty good. So we started to hit the brass. I'm going to stop and maybe pull out a sanding block. So this sandpaper's getting dull. Let me replace it real quick. I like to use this sandpaper that has a self-adhesive back. It's called Mirka. It's made in Finland. It's good quality paper. Let me pull a piece off the rack here. Okay, so we're going to sand that down a little bit. Okay, so that's good. Let's see if there's any other areas we should hit before we disassemble the gun. Everything should be pretty good. Now we'll take it pretty much down. We'll definitely leave the butt plate on. And to start work, we may leave the barrel in, but we may not, so we'll see. But basically I'm going to disassemble the gun, and I think you know the procedure for that since we showed how to put it together. And then I'll come back to you here, and we'll start sanding a little bit more. So I'll see you here in a few minutes. Okay, back with you. I have the rifle mostly disassembled. The butt plate's still on the gun because it'll provide a guide to how far we can sand the stock down. I left the trigger plate in. It could come out. It doesn't really make a difference. It's flush with the wood. And of course the nose cap is pinned on, so it's gonna stay. So we're just gonna go ahead and start sanding this. Let's go ahead and hit the particular areas we knew the wood was a little bit high, like at the front of the guard. Let's go ahead and hit that. First, I'd like to make mention of how to sand. It's a good idea well, you really need to back the sandpaper with something. So you don't just want to hold the sandpaper in your hands. You don't just want to fold it over and rub it on the stock. That wouldn't be good. You want to back it with something. You can use a piece of wood. There's a piece of wood. Let's see here. Sometimes here's a piece of wood with a little rubber glued to it. You can even wrap it around a file. Nothing wrong with that. Take the file and wrap sandpaper around it. These little pads are sold by some of the woodworking supply places, and I find it to be real helpful. This is one that I use a whole bunch with this cross section. So you can just kind of pick a spot on your paper and fold it around. I like to kind of hold it tight, and then go ahead and go to it. Now I'm going to hit those areas that were a little bit high. So here was a little high. You could see that when I had the guard in place. So I'm just going to cut it down a little bit, and here is a little high too. That should be good. The trigger plate is pretty good. It's really basically flush, so we're going to leave that alone. We're going to hit the area where the guard was inlet a little heavier, because it did sit a little bit below the surface. So when I hit that area, I'm not just going to sand right where the guard inlet is. I want to blend it in, and especially since there's not a lot of wood in that particular area. If you focus on that area, you're just going to dig a hole. So I'm going to focus on either side of the guard inlet, just to cut it down just a little bit to blend it in. Extend even up the up the whole toe a little bit. Okay, we're getting somewhere. So that should be pretty good. Now I am gonna, it may make a little noise, but I have an air filtration unit that I'm gonna turn on. Maybe low would be good, or maybe not. Here, let's try low. It's still a little noisy. I'm gonna turn it off. The point is that sanding does make dust, and it's not the best stuff to breathe. Occasionally it probably won't hurt you, but when we're doing this on a regular basis, we like to try to keep the air pretty clean. So let's go ahead and get to it a little bit more. I think we've sanded most of the areas that need it to be flush with the hardware. One area that I will adjust a little more is at the entry pipe. We filed it pretty much flush, but where it transitions, let's see if I can find a pointer, down over the hump of the forestock, we'll kind of work that area down a little bit. I could do it with a file, but if I hold the sandpaper tight, I can do it too. The whole idea is you just want the wood to be even with the metal parts, not above. Okay. That's really all there is to it. So now let's do a little more general sanding. You can start in a lot of different places. I'm gonna go ahead and just start right here at the lock panel. But like I said, a lot of places you can start. So I'm gonna hit this lock panel. Lock panel is, excuse me, the side plate panel. That's the flat wood that's surrounding the side plate. What I'm looking for is to remove any kind of machine marks. This is 150 grit that I'm starting with. I didn't mention that. So any machine marks I want to remove. Any tears in the grain need to come out as well. Now one thing that's very important, which would be a little less obvious in the video, is I use an articulating arm light. And you want to be able to move the light constantly. And ideally, you position it such that you can cast shadows and it'll reveal any defects. So you want to basically make the stock look as bad as you can while you're working on it, so you can find all the defects. And then when you finish it, and when you're looking at it under normal conditions, it'll look good. So I'm going to move the light to cast shadows. It's light at a low angle relative to your workpiece. And while I'm sanding, that'll show any particular areas that need a little more attention. Now this piece of wood is okay. Like I mentioned before, it's not a great piece of wood. It's an okay piece of wood. It's a piece of red maple, average hardness, and has some decent figure on it. And each piece of wood kind of sands and works a little bit differently. Before I go too far, I will mention too that you can scrape, and the scrapers I use are just card scrapers. So that is an option too, and we'll maybe go into a little more detail about scraping later. But first we're just going to talk about sanding. So I flattened off the lock panel. Now, one thing I do want to mention is the area working up to the lock panel. This is an area that sometimes people will struggle with. I'll first explain what you don't want to do. You don't want to sand sort of with the lock panel like this, if it makes any sense, or you'll very likely cut a groove along in the transition between the wrist and the lock panel. A better approach is to sand with the wrist and just come up and stop at that corner. So I guess what I'm trying to say is sand with the axis of the wrist. Any particular minor reshaping that you want to do can be done while you're sanding as well. Because I ended up narrowing the tip of this lock panel just a tiny bit. You don't want it pointy, Pointy is something that you see people do on occasion, but it's mostly kind of represents, well, it's often done by people that are not as experienced. They think that it needs to come to a point, but usually if you look closely at originals, the lock panels are a little blunter and end in a bit of a radius. So I'm moving to a different area of the sandpaper because it will kind of plug up. I'm just hitting this a little more just to refine the shape. You don't have to, but I just want to do it, so I'm doing it. Okay. The key is just to keep moving your light and keep sanding. Some wood machines much nicer, and by machining I'm referring to the process we use to shape the stalks. And then oftentimes those pieces that machine real well are real hard pieces. Those pieces will often sand a little better too. Softer pieces are more fuzzy and don't machine or sand as well. But not all wood is the absolute best wood. There's a range, and you have to work within that range for what's available. We try very hard though to provide the best quality wood we can, and we're constantly trying to develop new sources. Okay, so this is the general process. I'm just coming down the wrist and blending everything in and taking out any particular marks. Again, this is 150 paper, 150 grit paper. Any grain tears or tooling marks or anything that shouldn't be there. Keep moving the light, and I can only move the light so much because of the camera here, but I would be moving a little bit more under ordinary circumstances. And come up here in the comb. This has a little bit of a radius, so I can use it to come up in here a little bit, get it all cleaned up. So it just takes some time. Here in a second, we'll hit the area around the butt plate. That probably needs a little bit of explanation. This requires a little patience, but the amount of time that you spend in this process pays off with the final finish. So once it's finished, you really can't fix any defects that are present. And by defects, I mean, you know, tool marks that are left, or things of that nature. And tool marks aren't necessarily a bad thing, but you certainly wouldn't want any tool marks that are left over from the stock shaping process that we use. A little bit of torn grain there, so trying to hit it a little more. Okay, so I won't bore you with too much more of this. We will focus a little more on the butt plate area. I've left the butt plate on because it does provide a guide to how much wood can be removed. If the wood's a little bit below the butt plate, that's fine. That's not a problem, because on original guns with wood shrinkage, you do see the butt plate stick over the edge of the wood a little bit, but you don't want the wood any higher than the butt plate. So we're going to talk about that here. The area directly behind the cheek piece, in front of the butt plate, is often an area that's carved. So if you do want to carve the gun, you probably won't want to sand the wood flush with the butt plate, or file it flush with the butt plate, whatever you choose to use. In this case, you can see a little bit of wood does stick up above the butt plate, not a lot, tiny little bit. So that little wood is valuable if you want to do relief carving. But in this case, I don't believe this particular customer wants to do any relief carving on this, so we're going to cut it down flush with the butt plate. And there's not that much, there's just a little bit. So we could use a file, or we can use sandpaper. Either one would work. I'm going to use a sanding block and see if I can cut it down flush with the butt plate. In this case, it's kind of wiggly, so I'm going to move this prop that I have underneath to stabilize the stock a little bit. We could also use a file for this process. Which there's a little more than I thought, so a file might actually be a good choice rather than sandpaper, but with just a little patience, you could do it with sandpaper. So I'm going to just hit it real quick with a little file. That real fine rasp would be good, but even just a regular file would work. And this is I don't know how to pronounce the name, but an Aurea rasp. They're made in France and they're hand stitched. They're very good rasp. This is a number 9 grain. They're very expensive. This is just something the average person would not need to get, but for those of you that are more interested in this thing, might be interested in it. They do go dull fairly fast, and this thing is a little dull right now, to be honest. You can send them out and have them sharpened, but that's what this needs. It's been sent out once, or I just need to buy a new one. Okay, so that's coming along pretty good. And a file would work fine for this, or like I said, even just sandpaper on a block. There's really not that much wood sticking up there. Maybe, I don't know how much, but not much. So I'll just continue with this process until it's flush, which it's well on its way right now. Okay. And it's kind of a compromise in making these kits. I want to leave a little bit of wood in case somebody wants to carve. But then I don't want to make it too difficult to remove and be even with the butt plate if somebody doesn't want to carve it. So it's just a bit of a compromise, but I guess all things are. Almost there. And then we'll go over to the other side. Okay, that looks pretty good. Putting the butt plate all along. And the sandpaper does go dull, so change it often, because it just slows you down if you don't. So that's the idea. So that's nice and flush, so excuse me, we're good to go. That. On the other side, the area along the box and the butt plate needs a little attention. So again, as I mentioned before, the area where the box mates up with the box lid mates up with the stock is flat, is perfectly flat. So we can come along with our sanding block and just make sure that's flat. We've already done this previously, but we'll do it again. And then in a previous video, we showed how we scribed a little line around the edge of the box inlet, or the perimeter of the box lid. And let me slide it on here and I can show you. Got some sawdust in there or something. There it goes. So we used a scribe to come along here like this. Now we use our sandpaper or file, either one will work. We can kind of go up to that line. So in this area we want it flush with the butt plate. It's there now. And then we're going to work right up to that line. Keep moving the light. Got any torn grain or any defects? Work up around the front. Okay, that's looking pretty good. So we're going to do the area below the box lid. Basically same drill. Moving the light so I can see a little bit better. After you have an air filtration going most of the time and then not, this dust is really annoying. So working right up to that scribe line, and then also cutting down to the edge of the butt plate, which is basically right there, a tiny bit more. Just started to hit the butt plate. We don't really want to dive it over or anything like that. We want to blend it all back so it maintains the same stock contour. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. I will get a new piece of sandpaper and do just a little bit more in that area. Let me go ahead and grab another piece. That's pretty good. So I'll continue this whole process over the entire stock with 150 grit paper. And then I would go to 220 grit paper, repeating the same steps over everywhere. After 220 grit paper, it would be then good to stop and do what's called grazing the grain. And we'll talk a little bit about that here shortly. What we'll probably do now is I'll probably take a little break from the video. I'll keep sanding. I'll get the stock entirely sanded to the 150 grit, and then I'll come back with you. Actually, I'll probably go to the 220 grit like I mentioned, and then I'll come back with you and we'll talk about grazing the grain. So I'll see you here in a little bit. Okay, I'm back with you now. I've taken time to sand the stock to 150 grit, and then I followed it up with 220 grit. So the whole stock is sanded now to 220 grit. Looks pretty good. It's something that takes some time, so be patient with it, because how well you do this job will influence how nice the finish comes out. After you've sanded it well to 220 grit, the next step is to do what's called graze the grain, or whisker the stock is another phrase for it that's used. And during the sanding and filing or any kind of shaping process on a stock, the grain sometimes gets compressed. And if you think about wood being just a series of straws that are kind of stacked up, if there's any trauma to the wood, it can crush those straws. And for example, right now the stock may look very smooth and very nice, and basically like you could finish it. You know, it's ready to, you'd think it's ready to go. But when you put water on it, it'll fuzz up. and it'll look kind of nasty. So the idea with this process is to raise the grain now so it doesn't happen during the finishing process or sometime down the road. So it's a very simple process. All we're going to do is take a paper towel that's saturated with water, and then we're going to wipe it on the stalk, and probably you can allow it to dry in the air, or you could follow it up with a heat gun. I'll probably follow up with a heat gun to dry it, and then we're going to sand it down again with sharp paper to cut off the bit of grain that raised. So here's how it goes. You can start to see the curl too, which is kind of neat during this process. The curl sometimes is obscured during the sanding process. So it's a pretty wet rag. The cheek side has a little more curl on this, but this side looks pretty good too. Try to make sure you get everywhere. Okay, that's getting there. Make sure you put enough water on it. You don't want to have too little or it can not work properly. Okay, so I think we've pretty much gotten everywhere. So I'll demonstrate with the heat gun, but I'll probably just let this dry in air. Some people say that the heat gun does a little better job of raising the grain. I'm not sure about that. Okay, now I'm also going to do, you see the toe soaked it up a little faster here. Make sure I got everywhere. Now I'm also going to do the box lid, which I sanded as well. Okay. We'll let that dry. So if we use a heat gun, let me get the heat gun and set this stalk here. I'm going to turn off a piece of equipment that's making a little noise over there too. What you may have heard in the background is an air dryer that's used to take moisture out of compressed air. So some of the CNC equipment that we have requires real dry compressed air, and so that's what we have to use. Okay, so getting back to the stalk, let me plug in a heat gun and just show you how you can dry it with the heat gun. Really, it's not a pretty simple matter, but we'll go ahead and demonstrate it. So if you choose to use the heat gun, it's just low is probably good enough. Just dry it off. Interestingly enough, you can see the stripes a little more, and that's because basically the grain is going through the wood in a wavy pattern. When you cut through that wavy pattern in more or less a plane, some areas have more end grain exposed. The areas that have more end grain exposed are the stripes. So that's what, in a nutshell, gives the appearance of curly maple. You hear some people talk about how it's harder wood versus softer wood. It really isn't. It's just grain orientation relative to your surface. So I'll just keep on going through this process. I may just let it dry. I may dry it with the heat gun. We'll see. And then we're going to come back and sand it off a little bit. So I'll bring you back after it's all dry. Okay, so I think we've got the stalk pretty well dried with the heat gun. What once seemed like a real nice smooth stalk now has some roughness. And I don't know if you can see it or not. You probably can if we get the light right. See some of the roughness in the buttstock. And it's has various areas like that. So we need to smooth it up again is what we need to do. I'd like to also note one thing while we're at it is we've dimmed the overhead lights, the fluorescent lights. And the reason those are dimmed is because when I was initially sanding the stock, it's nice to have just cross lighting. You can usually do a little bit better job of seeing any potential defects and so forth. So fill light is not the greatest thing for gun making, in my opinion. If we're doing fine work, I'll oftentimes dim the overhead lights and just have an articulating light on that you can move around. So we're gonna now get some fresh paper. You want fresh, sharp paper. And I'm gonna go to 220 grit again. We could have gone to 320 grit, but 220 grit again because it's fairly coarse. The grain rate raised up a decent amount, so it needs a little attention. Here's one piece I'm going to grab. Well, I'll grab one other piece too. We're basically going to sand the stock again till we think it's perfect. Then we're going to wet it down another time. So, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sand the area that I'm going to squeeze in the vise so I don't just mash down the fibers when I put it in the vise. In this case, I've just folded over some paper. Since we're doing a very light sanding, that's not a problem. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Now we're going to put it in the vise and go through the whole process once again. I'll get started here, and then I'll probably go off camera for a little while and finish up. Okay, so get this cleaned up a little bit. One thing I can note also is that I've not been obsessive about it, but it's a good idea to try to maintain corners when you're doing this kind of work. At the end, if you want it softened a little bit, there's nothing wrong with breaking the corners on lock panels and say toe lines or comb lines. But you don't just want to, you want to be careful when you're sanding and not just obliterate the form that was already present. Okay, so we're going to cut down any of the stock that has a little fuzz raised up. People often refer to as whiskers. And we can also, like I mentioned, I folded over a piece of sandpaper and we can use that to work up to the lock panel. Cut down any of those defects you see. Constantly moving the light. So there isn't a great deal of material that needs removed, just what has risen up from the water absorbing and re-expanding the wood fibers to their more natural form. Here I'll use the backing a little bit. I can just be a little more careful right in here. Okay, so we are making progress. One thing that's interesting, after you get the first sanding stage done, let's say 150 grit, it takes some time, but all subsequent steps go pretty fast. So I'm gonna go ahead and go off camera now, finish this up, and I'll bring you back. Okay, I'm back with you. I've spent some time, it didn't take too long, but I've sanded the stalk down again with 220 grit paper and sanded off any of the fuzz that raised up from when we raised the grain, and it's looking pretty slick and nice again. So the next step is we're gonna graze the grain once more. Now it's kind of debatable how many times you should raise the grain. I've gone as few as one, or maybe even at times none under special circumstances. Couple is a good compromise. See a little spot here that needs a little attention. The couple is a good compromise. If you're okay with a little coarser finish, you know, maybe just go with one. If you want a finer finish, maybe do it 3 times or 4 times if you want an exceptionally fine finish. And a lot of it depends on the wood too. Some wood will really fuzz up, and real hard wood, oftentimes the grain doesn't raise very much at all. So it just depends. But I'm gonna go ahead and raise this grain on this wood one more time. So let me step over to the sink and get some water on the rag, and we'll put it on once more and raise the grain. Now, I'll also mention there are ways you can sand after staining. You could sand after staining with whatever stain you use, pretty much. But this is a nice process to use here. So again, we're seeing the nice curl on here, which is always nice to see. I know I always get excited about staining again, that process, and raising the grain even, because it shows off the figure, which everybody loves. After this is all applied, dry, I'll sand it off with 320 grit paper, and then I'll call that good enough. And I may go and buff it a little bit with some Scotch-Brite too. And then the gun would be ready for finish, although we're not going to finish this stalk. It's going to go to a customer, but it would be ready for finish. Or carving, whichever you choose to do. So, same old drill as the last time. Make sure it's wet enough. Okay. That's all there is to it. So, I'm going to hit this with the heat gun again, like we demonstrated previously. And then sand it with 320 like I said, and I'll bring you back for the finished results. Okay, I'm back. So we've raised the grain the second time, and I've sanded to 320 grit, which, you know, like I said, it goes faster and faster each time. So the stalk is looking very good, and we could in fact stain the stalk now, which is a very, very fun part, but we're not going to do that on this rifle because this rifle is being sold in the white to a customer, so he'll have the fun of staining it. I will do one more thing, and that is hit the stalks with a little Scotch-Brite. This is maroon Scotch-Brite. This is actually well, this is Scotch-Brite. I like Mirka brand as well, maybe a little bit better. We'll take a piece of it, and we don't want to burnish it too hard, or it could inhibit the stain from penetrating real well, but a little bit of a buff won't hurt things. Kind of get down in any other areas that we might have missed with the sandpaper, and just hit it a little lightly. You can knock off the sharp edges of the lock panel a little bit too, or the comb. Don't rely on this stuff too much, but for using it a little bit, it's a nice thing. It also works real well in the finishing process. Way better than steel wool. Okay, so we're getting there. Just a light hit with this. This all can be done in a vise too. I'm just able to work a little faster by holding it. I'm avoiding the edges of inlets too. You don't want to round over any inlet edges. So during this whole process, I'm careful to not hit the edges of inlets. It might seem like I'm working fast and carelessly, but I'm really not. I mean, working fast, but not carelessly. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now, what I've done here is during the sanding process, I've gone right over the nose cap, so that polishes it up, and you know, it's ready to go. Maybe a tiny bit more polishing, but it's basically ready to go. And we'll cover more of that in the metal finishing and prep videos. So the box lid to do real quick, so we'll hit it. And then, like I said, this stock is ready for staining, or it's ready for carving if you choose to carve. Okay, so that's pretty much summarizes sanding. Now, I will talk a little bit about scraping, which we did mention at the outset of the wood finishing videos. It's an alternate to sanding. It probably requires a little bit more skill, but it is an option. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a very traditional finish. It can, one of the big advantages of scraping is it can give a texture to the surface, or it creates a surface that has a different appearance than a sanded surface, which can add a lot of interest. In one way, the surface will be less perfect, but the fact that it's less perfect can add a lot of character to your work, and you know, in a lot of ways, it's a nicer finish to a sanded stock. So we'll talk about it a little bit. We won't go into great detail since we've already prepared this stock by sanding, but we will go over a little bit of information about scraping. I'm going to set this stock aside, and I'm going to grab another gun that we can demonstrate some scraping on. Here is another rifle that's put together in the white. It's a very fine piece of wood. It's a piece of sugar maple. It has very nice tight curl, beautiful tight curl. So it's a great piece of wood. Everything you look for in a piece of wood. Not all wood scrapes as well as other wood. Usually wood that's a little harder scrapes a little better. So we'll kind of go through the process. I won't scrape this whole stock, but we'll demonstrate the basics of scraping a stock. So let me put it in the vise here. We'll talk a little about scrapers first. I have one buried here somewhere. The scraper is, basically a piece of spring steel, so it's, I don't know, hardened in the mid-40s on the Rockwell C scale. Just a thin piece of spring steel. You can use a saw blade, thin saw blade. Anything in that hardness range would be fine. Now, if you go online, there's a gazillion videos on sharpening a scraper, or how to prepare the edge of a scraper. So I'm not going to really get into that a great deal, although this one probably needs a little work done on it, so I'll run through it how I do it very fast. So let's just go ahead and get to that so I can demonstrate it. With the scraper, oops. You need to start with this edge being square to the face. So the easiest way to do that, you can use a stone, probably the quickest and easiest, at least to get it going, is a mill file. So we're gonna run, this gun's in the way, I'll move it here. Find a place to stick it. So we're gonna run the mill file along the top of the scraper. This is a thin scraper. maybe 15 thousandths. I don't know, I'd have to measure it. 20 thousandths. I like the thin ones for gun work. Okay, so that's nice and trued up, and we're going to go ahead and, rather than, I could run this along here, I guess I will, but we could just stone that flat too. Okay, so now I'm going to step aside here for a minute and get a stone, and we'll smooth that edge up further. So I'll be back in 1 second. Okay, I have a stone here. This happens to be a water stone, lots of different stones, abrasive stones for sharpening. So you have a lot of choices here, and we won't really go into that right now. So I'm just gonna go along here, this edge, work this edge a little bit. And this is gonna be kind of the quick abbreviated version. I'd take a little more time if I was doing this myself and not on video. So I'm doing the face, getting that smoothed out a little bit, and then do the edge. Okay, so I'm going to call that good enough, even though it could probably stand a little more work than that. Have a paper towel I can wipe it off with. So now, get that grit off of there. Now we have more or less a square edge. And it will scrape with just a square edge, but it'll scrape a little better if we do what's called turning the burr on it. So this vise here doesn't work great for this, but hopefully it'll be okay. There's a hardened steel rod, and I'll put a little oil on it. If I find any oil. No, I don't seem to have any oil right here, so we're not going to use oil. The idea is to hold the rod at a slight angle, just a very slight angle, and push across the surface, and we'll roll a little bit of a burr. So I'm going to give it a try here, although this vise is a little short. We'll still give it a try. Some people get real obsessive about scraper sharpening. I don't. Okay. And we should start to feel a little hook, which there's not enough of it yet, so I need to do a little bit more. Not enough hook. Okay, let's see if we're getting any better. Yeah, I'm feeling a little bit of a hook now. I'm gonna go just a little more. Okay, now what I like to do, this would cut fine here like this. One thing I like to do is I like to flatten this burr out. So I can show you here, we'll do it in stages. To kind of draw that burr back up. This is a technique that you see occasionally, you hear occasionally, but it's not all that typical. So I'm raising that burr back up. And I'm going to turn it back down. And it'll be just, in my experience, it'll be a little sharper, a little better. Okay. So we've got a nice burr on here now. I'm testing it by, it catches my thumb and it feels good. So we're going to see if we can't do a little scraping here on the stock. I'll just go through the general procedure. So let's see here where we want to go. The stock actually would need a little more work done on it before it really should, before we scrape for real, but I'll just demonstrate it here. So you want to see one thing here, we've got a little bit of a defect on the side of the stock that has to be dealt with first. But that's okay. We'll just do a little scraping. I'm finding the edge that has the burr, and then we're going to scrape along. I can feel that this is really rippling up nice. So it's kind of following the curl, which is neat. Go this way now a little bit. It's not scraping as well this way. It is going okay. Sometimes you get long shavings, sometimes you won't. That also depends on how well you sharpen your scraper. And curly wood scrapes a little different than other wood. Okay, so that's really the gist of scraping. We'll do up some areas up to 4 stalk as well. I'll show you. Let's see here. Let's do right here. So the gist of scraping is it pulls off a little curl. You really want more of a shaving rather than dust. So here's up to 4 stalk. We can show it a little bit, and there it's curling up nice. Biting in nice and curling. So you just keep running this along. You can be careful and run it up along your lock moldings and such. Get into the groove a little bit, and it goes a little better. It actually removes wood very fast, faster than sandpaper, and leaves a smooth finish as well. So it's a more efficient process than sanding as well. It does require a little more skill. So that's just a quick little synopsis of the scraping process. I will mention one more thing is that the thin scraper allows you to flex it in your thumbs, and you can get into areas like the concavity above the cheek piece. Very tight areas like along the comb. You can use more specialized scrapers. Here's a gooseneck scraper that I sometimes use. I have some other little small scrapers somewhere. Here's a little small one that I've made that has, excuse me, a radius that lets you get up near the comb more. That side has a little more gentle radius. So you can make these whatever shape you want. There's another one. So we'll just leave it at that with the scraping, and we may talk more about that in future videos. Thank you.